Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We take the sources, theological research, the notes, some challenging scripture, and we do a deep dive to pull out the core insights you need. It's really a shortcut to being well-informed, just for you.
And our focus today is it's on a really short passage that I think feels like an immediate gut check for any believer. We're looking at James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. And it has what might be the most startling and counterintuitive instruction in the entire New Testament.
It is a shocking command.
Right.
I mean, James looks at believers who are facing massive upheaval, and he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds."
That's right.
If you've ever sat in the middle of, real loss or sickness or a relationship falling apart, that instruction sounds almost impossible. It sounds a little bit like psychological denial.
It does. It really does, if we confuse what the Bible is commanding with some kind of forced emotional happiness. But our mission today is to show why this response is not only rational, but necessary. James isn't giving us an emotional slogan. He provides a specific theological logic that's rooted in God's sovereign purpose. So we're going to analyze the precise divine sequence he lays out.
But yes.
Trials lead to testing. That testing produces steadfastness, and then that steadfastness results in maturity. If we can get a handle on that logic, the joy he's talking about is actually grounded in reality.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And a good place to start is grounding ourselves in who James was actually speaking to. He addresses the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Now, this was not some comfortable local congregation.
Not at all. We are talking about Jewish Christians who have been scattered across the known world, probably after the persecution that followed Stephen's stoning.
Right.
And that word dispersion is critical. It signals displacement. These believers weren't just, geographically separated. They were socially and economically just completely destabilized.
They had lost their anchors. I mean, think about that for a second. They were strangers in foreign lands. They were often looked down on by the pagan culture around them, and at the same time, ostracized by the Jewish community back home because they followed Christ.
So you have this immense social marginalization, and when you don't have cultural roots, you almost always face economic pressure. Our sources point out that a lot of James's readers were poor. They were relying on things like agricultural labor or day wages, which made them incredibly vulnerable to exploitation, and that's a topic James hits really hard later in the letter.
And the trials weren't just one thing. He says trials of various kinds. The sources list everything from, outright persecution and hostility.
Being marginalized, thrown in prison.
Right, to economic hardship, chronic illness, bereavement, even spiritual dryness, or conflict inside the church itself.
And the Greek verb for meet trials is fascinating. It has this sense of falling into them unexpectedly.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like a traveler who gets ambushed by bandits or stumbles into some kind of hostile situation. These sufferings are unannounced. They're uninvited intrusions. So James, as a pastor who saw this reality firsthand, is giving them a practical theological strategy for how to interpret these painful, random feeling events.
That sets the stage perfectly for the central act that he commands in verse 2, counting trials as joy.
Right.
He said this isn't about seeing painful events as interruptions, but as occasions for all joy. But I have to ask, if I am in the middle of a genuine crisis, how can I rationally count it all joy?
And the answer lies entirely in the single word James chooses for count. It's hogoses.
Hogoses.
Yeah, this is the pivot point for the entire passage. It's not an emotional suggestion. It's a decisive intellectual command. It's directed right at the believer's mind, not at their feelings.
So if I'm weeping, this command doesn't mean I have to stop weeping and force a smile. It means I have to think differently about the very event that's causing the tears.
Precisely. Hogoseth means to reckon, to calculate, or to make a settled judgment.
The verb is used in other contexts for, intellectual work like Caesar reckoning his army's strength or a philosopher calculating the worth of an argument. It's a cognitive discipline.
I see.
And the grammar just confirms this. It's an aorist imperative, which basically means make this judgment right now decisively and let this command stand.
So if the immediate feeling is pain, the command is to override that subjective feeling with an objective theological truth. I have to interpret the event through God's purpose, not my emotional discomfort.
And that leads right into the scope of it. All joy. As the source material defines it, this means joy becomes the dominant perspective.
The controlling assessment.
Exactly, the controlling assessment. It signifies a radical reorientation where you, the believer, place a higher value on Christ-likeness and God's purposes than on your immediate comfort and relief. But let's challenge that for a moment. If joy is the controlling assessment, doesn't that require me to suppress the reality of the grief?
Yeah.
I mean, the songs are just full of lament, these honest expressions of devastation and feeling abandoned. How does all joy coexist with, authentic lament?
That's a crucial tension, and James is not asking us to deny reality. The joy we are commanding ourselves to recognize is the joy of the outcome, not the joy of the pain.
Okay, that's a key
A
distinction.
huge distinction. The believer can weep over the loss while at the same time rejoicing in the conviction that this pain is purposeful. The sources confirm that true biblical joy allows grief and confusion to coexist with a settled conviction about God's good design.
I see. It's almost like having a fever. You feel miserable because of the fever, that's a pain, but you might feel a measure of, I don't know, security or even relief.
Mm-hmm.
Because the fever is a sign your immune system is working exactly as it should to fight the illness. The system is functioning to produce a good result, even though it feels terrible.
That's an excellent way to put it. And this concept is really well illustrated by an analogy we found in the sources. The accountant or the investor analogy.
Okay, let's expand on that.
Right.
Let's say an investor is reviewing their portfolio, and they see a massive temporary cash loss because they just purchased a piece of specialized, expensive equipment, a capital expenditure.
Right.
The emotional reaction might just be panic. My liquidity's gone. I'm losing money.
But the accountant who knows the business strategy, they don't look at that cash flow statement in isolation. They count it, or they reckon that expense, not as a failure or a disaster,
Right.
but as a strategic asset investment. The intellectual judgment classifies that transaction as positive because they know that expense is necessary to generate a far greater revenue stream down the road.
So the immediate pain, the empty cash drawer, is
Yeah.
real, but the intellectual judgment dictates joy because the good result is already known.
It's known. And this means the joy is rational, which is exactly what James affirms in verse 3. He says, "For you know."
Ah, there it is.
It isn't some magical feeling. It's grounded in knowledge. We can count it joy because we know the process God is initiating through this trial.
Yeah.
If we didn't know the sequence, the command would be absurd.
All right, it'd be cruel.
Exactly. The rationality of the joy flows directly from the knowledge that the trial isn't random. It's productive. The believer refuses to measure the event by comfort. Instead, they evaluate it by its ability to produce spiritual growth.
And that conviction introduces the next step in the process, the refining mechanism. James sets up a very clear cause and effect relationship in verse 3. The testing of your faith produces steadfastness.
So how does this testing function as the core rationale?
It acts as the pipeline.
Yeah.
That's the engine. Without this process, the command for joy in the furnace is just, a spiritual platitude. The phrase testing of your faith is everything.
Okay.
The Greek term used here, dokimion, is drawn from the world of metallurgy and ancient currency.
The refining fire imagery. Yes. It's a quality test, but it's specifically designed not to destroy the metal, but to prove its genuineness and purity. The crucible fire exposes whether the material is real silver or if it's just cheap alloy.
So trials, then, they force our faith out into the open.
They do. Adversity acts like a kind of chemical agent that separates what's genuine from what's just dross.
That's a powerful picture.
And this process strengthens faith by burning away the impurities that cling to us, our hidden idols. These are often things like self-reliance or the superficial expectation that God is only supposed to grant us an easy life.
Or just the idolatry of comfort.
Exactly, the idolatry of comfort. The trial forces us to ask, is my trust anchored in God's character and his promises, or was my trust only as deep as my outward prosperity and ease allowed it to be?
It reveals reality. It confirms if the faith is robust enough to rely on God, even when God doesn't seem to be providing that immediate relief.
And the result of that refining process is steadfastness, or hypomone. The literal meaning is remaining under.
Remaining
Under a heavy load rather than fleeing from it or, seeking immediate sinful relief. It's the capacity to bear sustained, often crushing, pressure without collapsing spiritually or abandoning obedience.
When I hear remaining under, I sometimes think of like a stoic resignation, just gritting my teeth and waiting for it to be over. But that doesn't really sound like what James is aiming for here.
It's the opposite of grim resignation. Hypomone is active perseverance in faith and obedience. It's an active state of maintaining hope, of continuing to pray, continuing to obey the commands of Scripture, and continuing to love others, even when the external environment is hostile and your internal environment is just suffering.
And this quality is created, right? It's not just revealed. The text seems to suggest that this resilient, persevering trust wouldn't exist in the same way without the trial.
That's essential. The Greek verb for produces here is katargazetai. It signals an ongoing, habitual, and kind of intense working out. Trials are continuously generating this endurance in the believer who submits to the process.
You know, Paul, later in Romans 5, uses this same causal link. He says suffering brings about endurance, which develops tested character.
Yes, exactly. It's a consistent biblical theology that God uses pressure for production.
Let's use the steel analogy to illustrate that active production. Raw iron is pretty soft. Forging steel requires immense heat and continuous, almost brutal hammering. The heat and the hammering don't just reveal the existing hardness of the iron, they fundamentally change its molecular structure.
They actually rearrange the grain. They create a far more resilient, durable material. The steel only becomes resilient because it went through the fire and the impact.
So active perseverance, then, is the refusal to compromise your integrity or seek those sinful shortcuts.
The bitterness, the deceit.
The giving up on prayer just to relieve the immediate pressure of the heat. It's the conscious decision to stay in the furnace until the forging is complete.
I like the weightlifter analogy here, too. The person with hypomone isn't just standing there. They are actively resisting the force of gravity. They are remaining under the iron, their muscles are trembling with effort, and they're refusing to drop that heavy barbell until the prescribed set is complete and the muscle fibers have broken down to be rebuilt stronger.
They're focused on the long-term strength gain, not the immediate muscle burn.
Exactly. That physical analogy captures the effort required. Steadfastness requires the will to actively work under pressure, focusing on the goal the master architect has planned.
And that brings us to the final stage of the sequence in James 1.4, the grand purpose. Steadfastness isn't the end goal.
No, steadfastness is merely the working tool. The goal is achieving a state of being perfect and complete, lacking in nothing.
When I read that word perfect, teleoi, my natural reflex is to think about moral flawlessness, sinless perfection, which we know isn't something we achieve in this life. So how is James using this term?
It's a great question. Teleoi should be understood in its sense of finished or brought to maturity. It's referring to a goal, a telos. It describes a believer who has achieved a kind of spiritual ripeness or has been brought toward the specific goal for which God redeemed them.
So the picture isn't a flawless surface, but maybe a structurally sound house that's finished according to the architect's plans and is capable of bearing the weight of the next storm.
That's it. It means spiritual functionality and readiness. And this is coupled with the term complete, holokleroi. That word has a sense of integration, doesn't it?
It does. Holokleroi conveys wholeness, integrity, and undividedness. And this is directly related to the problem James addresses later in the chapter, the double-minded man, who is unstable in all his ways.
Right. So the trials are intended to cure that instability by integrating the believer's loyalties so that the whole life is consistently devoted to God.
And the paradox of lacking in nothing is just startling when you remember that these people were scattered, they were poor, they were marginalized. I mean, they literally lacked economic security and physical comfort.
And that is the whole point. God enriches the believer with resilient character, even as comforts, securities, and all these earthly props are stripped away. The loss of worldly props reveals the gain of Christ-like stability.
So he's redefining wealth.
He's completely redefining what it means to be truly wealthy and complete. The true wealth, James argues, is not the security we lose, but the integrated character we gain.
And that repositioning of value, it places the goal directly within the doctrine of sanctification. We have to recall Romans 8.28, which states that all things, including trials, work for the good of those who love God. And that good is explicitly defined as being conformed to the image of his Son.
So trials are God's appointed curriculum for holiness. They are the instruments he uses to shape us into Christ's likeness, a likeness that inherently includes endurance and sacrifice. This kind of maturity, it just can't be cultivated in a life of uninterrupted ease.
Let's use the sculptor analogy again, but maybe deepen it. If we're the raw stone, then the chisel strikes, the painful removal of material, are absolutely necessary. The goal is not destruction or even just survival.
No, the ultimate goal of the sculptor is the revelation of the perfect and complete image, the image of Christ, that's hidden within the raw stone.
So the sculptor just keeps striking, until the masterpiece is fully revealed, lacking nothing that the original design intended. The process is painful, but the purpose is glorious.
But this entire process is conditional, which is critical. Verse 4 says we must let steadfastness have its full effect.
Which shows we have a vital, active responsibility. We can stop the sculptor's hand.
We can interrupt the refining fire. If the believer bails out of the trial through unbelief or active disobedience or some kind of compromise.
What would that look like?
Well, say, by resorting to manipulation or bitterness or deceit just to find some relief, they short-circuit the divine mechanism. They fail to gain the intended maturity because they stopped the work before the structure was cured.
So, letting steadfastness have its full effect means actively remaining in submission to God's plan for that trial, however long or painful it is.
It means maintaining obedience and trust, knowing that the time under pressure is precisely the time required for that structure to become perfect and complete.
Stepping back, it's clear James's logic isn't a standalone doctrine. It fits perfectly into a consistent theological framework of suffering unto glory that runs throughout Scripture.
And that consistency is one of the strongest arguments for the rationality of James's command. We already noted Paul's similar sequence in Romans 5, where suffering produces endurance.
Endurance produces character-tested character, and character produces hope.
Why do you think Paul adds hope to the sequence where James focuses on maturity?
Well, they're interconnected. The tested character, which is the fruit of endurance, it gives the believer objective evidence that their faith is real and that God is at work.
And that evidence strengthens their conviction that God will finish what he started, which is what grounds their hope. The assurance that future glory is coming. The ability to endure now is evidence of the promise of future salvation.
And the ultimate framework, the pattern for the Christian life, it has to always mirror Christ's experience. It's the pattern of cross and crown.
It's the suffering unto glory arc. You have to look at Hebrews 12, verses 2 and 3 here. Jesus endured the cross for the joy that was set before him. He wasn't taking pleasure in the physical agony of crucifixion or the shame of being rejected. He was focused on the glorious outcome, his exaltation, his return to the Father's side, and the salvation of his people.
So when James calls us to count it all joy, he's really calling us to adopt the same Christ-shaped, future-oriented perspective, look past the pain and the shame of the trial to the glorious outcome, being perfected into Christ's image and ultimately being gathered into glory.
Right. Our suffering, therefore, isn't a deviation from the path of Christ. It is the path of Christ. If the master was perfected through suffering, how can the student expect to be perfected through ease?
And crucially, this requires a robust doctrine of God's providence, which, coming from the Reformed tradition, we affirm deeply. Trials cannot be random accidents.
No. If trials were random, the command to rejoice would just be cruelty. If suffering is just meaningless chaos, then James is telling us to fake joy in the face of meaninglessness.
Yeah.
But because we believe in God's sovereignty, we know trials fall under the rule of a wise and good God. They are included in the all things that he is weaving together for our good.
And this conviction guards the command to rejoice from being, reduced to just some bare psychological technique. It's a theological response to a God who is actively working in and behind the trial.
You think of Joseph again, sold into slavery. When he finally confronts his brothers, he acknowledges their wicked human intent. He says, "You meant evil against me." But he immediately adds the theological interpretive framework. But God meant it for good. The evil was real, the pain was real, but the event was simultaneously and sovereignly purposed by God for a saving end. And that is the conviction James demands of us.
That conviction is only useful if we consciously adopt James's framework and actively reject the competing narratives of suffering that, they dominate our culture. Critical thinking is required here.
Absolutely. What we believe about our pain determines how we respond to it, and at the end of the day, what we become. If we instinctively interpret our hardship through worldly or unbiblical lenses, James's command will seem impossible, or maybe even deeply offensive.
Okay, so let's start with contrast one, the prosperity gospel. This view treats trials, sickness, financial stress as evidence of weak faith or hidden sin, or just a lack of God's favor.
The foundational failure here is that the prosperity view replaces James's assumption, which is when you meet trials. Not if, when, with an assumption of its own, that trials are an anomaly that must be exercised by sufficient faith. James explicitly assumes the Christian life will be defined by trials of various kinds. They are expected features.
And the practical damage this view causes is massive. It robs sufferers of the very comfort James is offering.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing the pain as God's necessary tool for refinement and production of steadfastness, the sufferer is often left concluding that they've personally failed God, or that they're being punished.
It replaces refinement with guilt. And when the suffering continues, the natural response for someone embedded in that prosperity framework is often to abandon faith altogether, because the deal they thought they made with God, health, and wealth for obedience has been broken.
Right.
James offers the opposite. Suffering is proof that God is invested in perfecting your character.
So our second rival interpretation, contrast to, comes from secular self-help and, therapeutic culture. This frames suffering purely as an opportunity for self-discovery or to fulfill personal desires, to find your true self or live your best life.
And the language sounds similar. They use words like resilience and growth, but the destination is fundamentally different. James interprets suffering in relation to God's will.
Okay.
It's about testing your faith and moving toward maturity as he defines it.
Whereas the secular view interprets suffering only in relation to the self. Pain is valuable only if it helps me become the kind of person I want to be. I use the pain to fulfill my own personal potential.
Right. The biblical goal is sanctification, holiness, as defined by conformity to Christ's character. The secular goal is self-actualization, becoming a more fulfilled version of yourself as defined by your subjective desires. When James commands us to become perfect and complete, it's a call to submit to God's definition of completeness, not the fulfillment of our personal wants.
And finally, contrast 3, stoicism and emotional denial. This is the temptation to just numb the heart, advocating for emotional detachment, or simply forcing yourself not to care about the pain.
This is a crucial area of contrast. Stoicism advocates for apatheia, a state of being free from emotional disturbance, as the path to tranquility. The Stoic seeks to control his internal world by minimizing his reactions to the external world.
But James's command to rejoice in the process is not a call to apatheia. True biblical steadfastness has to coexist with honest grief.
Absolutely. The Psalms, again, they show us believers who groan, who lament, who even accuse God, yet still choose to maintain their confidence in his character. The Christian doesn't deny pain, they bring it honestly before the Father.
So Stoicism offers an illusion of control, and it shuts down the very vulnerability required for the testing.
Yes, if you successfully numb yourself to the pain, you also successfully block the refining fire from doing its work. The goal is not to feel nothing. The goal is to feel the full weight of the trial and still choose to trust God in the face of it.
And that is the active perseverance of hypomone. It requires bringing that grief and vulnerability before God while continuing the hard work of obedience, rather than just putting on a brave face to avoid the deep work of testing.
Well said.
So let's transition now to practical application for life today. If the joy is an intellectual act, then the primary application has to begin in the mind.
It has to. It's about adopting a scripture-saturated grid. The primary application is intellectual. Adopting the framework trial leads to testing, leads to steadfastness, leads to maturity, and deliberately running every painful event through it.
So it requires refusing to accept the reflex to measure our lives only by the presence or absence of comfort.
Yes. It's the conscious discipline of asking, how is God using this specific loss, this specific illness, this specific conflict to refine my faith and move me toward maturity? That intellectual act is what pushes back against the temptation to despair or self-pity.
And this intellectual shift must lead to a reordering of desire. The command calls us to cultivate a heart that truly values Christ-likeness and holiness above ease and predictability. We have to confront our natural assumption that a good life means a comfortable life.
So practically what that means is praying that our desires be reordered to treasure God's purpose, his refining work, more than our desire for immediate relief.
So when we pray for relief, we should also pray, but more than relief, Father, conform me to the image of your Son through this.
Exactly. And finally, this demands active obedience under pressure, a response of the will. To let steadfastness have its full effect means refusing sinful escape routes when life is hard. It's a specific call to ongoing obedience under duress.
Can you give us some examples of those sinful escape rates? What do those look like?
They can be subtle. When you're experiencing relational strain, the sinful escape might be bitterness or slander or just withdrawal from the relationship. When you're facing a chronic illness, the sinful escape might be self-pity, resentment toward God, or neglecting the duties that you still have. When experiencing spiritual dryness, the escape is to abandon prayer and reading the Word.
Steadfastness, then, is the active work of remaining under that weight. It's continuing to read the Word, continuing to pray, continuing to gather with God's people, even when every feeling inside you is telling you that God is distant or uninterested. It's the work of maintaining integrity until the foundation is complete.
We can go back to that analogy of the curing process of concrete. The trial is the foundation being poured. Steadfastness is the concrete sitting undisturbed under pressure for the necessary time. If the believer disturbs the concrete or moves the weight too early, if they bail out, the structure is weak and it cracks.
But if they allow the concrete to remain under pressure, enduring that long waiting period until it's fully cured, it becomes a complete foundation, solid, integrated, and capable of bearing the structure of the house through any storm.
And James commands endurance because we know God is not wasting this trial. He's using the pressure to forge a resilient character that simply could not exist in a life spent seeking only ease.
Okay, so to summarize our deep dive into James 1.2 to 4, joy in suffering is possible not because we're commanded to enjoy the pain itself,
No.
but because the rational, intellectual judgment of the believer values the known result, a mature, integrated character fully conforming to Christ's image, more than immediate worldly comfort.
And God ensures that not a single moment of suffering is wasted in the believer's life.
The theological logic is so clear. Trials are not random accidents, but part of God's deliberate curriculum, intended to test our faith, burn away our impurities, produce that tenacious steadfastness, and safely bring us to a state of being perfect and complete, lacking in nothing.
And the command to count it all joy is therefore a rational, intellectual act of reinterpretation. It's grounded entirely in the knowledge of God's wise and sovereign providence, which is always working toward our holiness.
You know, Peter, using that same metallurgical image, states that tested faith is more precious than gold that perishes. So what stands out to you right now in comparing the value of material wealth which fades or rots or is stolen to the quality of enduring character that God is actively forging in your life through pain? That is the real reckoning James calls us to make. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.